I'm going to give you an example of Dylan, the protagonist of the text that I am reading. So if you don't remember the text I'm reading, I've got it here. Metalfish Falling Snow. Great book. So what I've done here is I've separated my analysis of Dylan's physical attributes into three different categories. I've used evidence for each of these categories. So I've got what has been directly or explicitly described by the author. I've got what has been implied by the author, and then I've got what I've assumed. So there's not really that much evidence for it, but it's a picture that I'm aware I've already got in my head of what Dylan is like physically. So let's run through this example. Firstly, the author has directly stated that Dylan is a girl. And I've used the quote here, when he found I was me instead of a son. So it's very explicitly stated that Dylan is a girl. That's one of her physical attributes. Of course, gender is a little bit more complicated than this, but in Dylan's way of describing, that is where we're at this moment. I also know that Dylan's 14. She says it directly. Besides, I'm 14, and by now it's probably seeped into my bone marrow. So again, physical trait, she's 14. I've got that explicitly stated. It's also explicitly stated that she has brown skin. And it's really important to the story. Her skin is something that is really important to her, but also important to characters around her. So I know they think brown skin is always somewhere else on the map. It's part of a quote where she is explicitly stating she has brown skin. I find it really interesting to think about the cultural background and the skin tone of the characters I'm reading about, because sometimes as a white person, there can be a tendency for me to assume all of the characters are like me. And that's obviously not the case. It's really important for us to look for actual evidence and to challenge our assumptions there. I've also got an implied physical character trait about her physical awkwardness. So obviously we can be a bit emotionally awkward. I'm like that. This character, I think it's implied that she's fairly physically awkward. So I've got the quote here, "We are more than our bodies." And it's part of a passage where it talks about the way she's physically interacting with the world around her. Lastly, I've got an assumption that I've made. I think of Dylan when I picture her as quite a wiry or gangly kind of person. And I've got this assumption, I realise, from the very start of the book where she's describing how she feels the cold. So in my mind, I'd internalised that to assume that she was quite wiry or gangly, but I don't actually have that much evidence for it. It's important for me to keep track of my assumptions about what Dylan looks like as I read, because it helps me understand what the author has intended Dylan to be like and how I'm imagining Dylan, how that process is playing out in my mind. So you've probably guessed I'm going to set you a task now. For 2 to 3 characters, I'd like you to go through these 3 categories. So the descriptions of their physical traits, the implications around their physical traits, and finally, any assumptions you're making about their physical traits. For the first 2 categories, so what is described and what is implied, I want you to have evidence. I want you to be able to find quotes from the text. For the third category, your assumptions, you don't necessarily need to have quotes from the text. After all, they're your assumptions. You probably can't find proof about them. So if you've got a picture in your head of what your characters look like, I'd like you to write down any assumptions you have that maybe aren't borne out yet in the way the text is unfolding. So you're going to do that for 2 to 3 characters. Pause the video now and undertake that task.